I'm Hannah Nicklin, as you heard. I am, among other things, a writer and narrative designer. I'm currently the lead narrative designer and writer on Mutazione, which is by a Copenhagen-based company called Die Gute Fabrik. We just announced it at GDC. Mutazione is a mutant soap opera featuring a lovable ensemble cast of humanoids in an isolated community full of alien flora and fauna. If that sounds at all interesting or appealing to you, if you just find me on Twitter, my pinned tweet is a trailer for the game, so you can watch that. I also have a bunch of cool side projects that I won't go into right now. I've got a PhD in using games to destroy capitalism, which is a work in progress. And while I've been a freelance writer for over a decade, only 4 of those years have been full-time in video games. As you heard, I've also worked in galleries, museums, theatres, and in the wonderful world of experimental performance. So a big part of my practice in politics over the past decade has been about widening the spaces in which we tell stories. And in using my abundant privilege as a white, cis woman from a Western context to bridge wherever possible between the resources that I have access to and marginalized people and causes. Sometimes that's been making games and digital installations which tell marginalized stories. Sometimes that's been running free workshops and mentoring so marginalized people can tell their own stories. And sometimes that's been using public resources in theory to fund an artwork about an issue, but in practice making something very cheaply that just about satisfies the brief and giving the rest of the money that I was given to a campaign group or marginalized groups that I've been working with. So stealing from the government, Robin Hood style, where possible. That practice, though, is more tied to my days of working in what you would call the arts industry. These days, most of my work is in the game industry, so I'm beginning to try and work out how I can do that bridge work there. Some of it is still workshops and mentoring, which I do, but I'm also trying to do the work of challenging how I think about the work that I'm involved in making, who we include in the process, and also who we make for. That last point is what I want to talk to you all about today. I want to invite us to think together using a kind of thought experiment to examine ourselves and our practices. What I'm about to propose is not a way of saying, I think everyone should work this way, but I'm offering it as a means of thinking about how we could work or think, to become more radically diverse and decolonized in how and what we make. Over the past century, the industry that I came from, theatre, went through a series of challenges to the idea of what audience means. Not just in terms of how they think about marketing, but because of interactive and immersive forms, audiences became participants, sources, instigators, passers-by, collaborators, spectators. Even if you just return to this marketing idea of audience, when you think about it, it's a totally meaningless term. We can talk about audiences and refer to typical demographics, but actually what we mean is a hypothetical gathering of people, a hypothetical number of them, in a single place. That's all it tells us. Schrodinger's audience. In terms of games, that makes me think that the word player is even less meaningful. I find myself often working with my colleagues arguing about the player. I don't think players will find this very clear, or I think players will find this much more compelling. In a medium where we design for interaction, the player is both everything and nothing. You don't know who they are. You don't know their gender identity or class background, their sexuality, race, religion, or religious heritage. You don't know what their first language is, if they have impairments, mental health issues, neurodiversity. You don't know where they are, what time it is, what they're worrying about, or who's with them. And it's actually kind of important that we admit that player is a useful pretense, an abstraction of everyone you hope will play your game, but also everyone who you can't imagine will play it. I think as a community, we're finally beginning to surface more of the important conversations that we need to have about representation in games across the different parts of the industry and the community, and talk with more usefully critical language about the characters we can play as, the stories they tell. We have companies like Xbox, for example, producing accessible controllers, which begins to address bodily difference on a mass scale. But when I design video games, I feel like the player is the last of my assumptions to fall. In most of the discussions I have when we speak of the player, they are almost always, in my head, this societally neutral idea of player, which I always feel like falls back to an everyman, and I do mean man, an able-bodied, white, cis-het man in a Western, English-speaking setting. So my talk is titled, "The Player is a Material Made Up of People," and by this I mean, I think it's useful for us to think of the player as a material. One which offers affordances, resistances, qualities, and one which is absolutely not neutral. In that context, instead of seeing game design as a thing done for a mass of neutral players, today I want to ask, what might a game design of radical difference look like if instead we shift the idea of player? What stories would we tell? What games would we design if we were designing for any other extremely specific experience than the very specific everyman? So this is not an argument against artistic vision or creative-led studios and works, but instead an invitation for us together to think about, from a different direction, how to diversify and decolonize our work. And that's done in our minds as much as elsewhere. A little bit before I start about how I want to investigate this question today with you. What I did was that I spent some time over the space of a month having 4 conversations with 4 people asking the question, what would games look like if we designed with or for you? I tried to make sure that the invitation to speak with me was not exploitative. I was transparent about what I would get from the talk, which is approximately 6 days of unpaid work for a flight, hotel, breakfast, a very expensive flight, and the boost to my career of having you all listen to me for about an hour. And in exchange, I offered them time, dinner, or resources in return. I also let them look over what I'm planning to say to you today to make sure that they agreed with how they were represented. So the 4 people that I spoke to are called Natalie, Sia, Harry, Josephine, and Linda. And in a gentle and conversational way, I asked them to talk about themselves, their current experience of games, and I asked them, what game would you make, or what game do you need from the world? It's worth pointing out that I have specific skills that I used here, which I developed through my community storytelling arts practice, and my work slotting into different teams over a decade as a freelancer, which was the ability to ask questions supportive enough that people feel like they know how to start answering, but open enough that you don't feel overly led in your responses. It's kind of vital to this kind of practice and in running good collaborative practices in general. I say this because I want to emphasize that I did not try and conduct a survey. The point of diversifying our idea of player here is not to produce one single new idea of player, but rather to redefine player every time we design with or for them. I guess I could hear like a criticism if I imagine the Twitter sphere shouting at me right now. But I want my games to have mass appeal, I hear angry people on Twitter cry, to which I reply, the masses are made up of people, the minority of whom are cis-het, able-bodied, Western white men. It's a boring thing to repeat by now, but it's still true. And this process is simply a way of trying to foreground that fact. By trying out this thought experiment today, I hope we might think about new exercises we can introduce into our practices, as well as our production methodologies, in order to diversify and decolonize both. Anyway, enough of me. Let's meet some of the people who were kind enough to speak with me. So first up, we're going to hear from Natalie. Natalie is a black woman of mixed heritage, born in Scotland, in Edinburgh, and educated in England. It's worth saying at this point that I am British. I live in Denmark, but a lot of the people that I spoke to are going to be from my communities, my connections, so they are going to be kind of British-centric. Natalie's pronouns are she, her. She identifies as bisexual, as a queer woman exploring Christianity, working class born but middle class through education and profession. And she works as a CEO and director of a theatre company which champions stories that illuminate the mixed, multiple experience of what it is to be of African heritage in Britain today. So I'm going to quote here. She says, "I feel like everything about me may be perceived, or you may be told, is different to the norm. My body and all of the spaces which I move through, even in my own family as the darkest of a mixed heritage family, I just take for granted that my existence in all the places I move through is political." So Natalie is one of the strongest voices in my circles that I see challenging what in the UK we call the diversity debate. Not just challenging who tells the story, but also who you're telling the story to. So quote, "In my business, we take the position that a person of colour, a person of African heritage, has more in common than the heteronormative cis-het white middle-class man we're told is our lens for the world. The challenge is, what would that look like for games?" She says, "I always thought the role of the artist is to tell us about the world we're moving into, and yet it's all just so basic. The stories we're living are so far ahead of the stories that we're telling." So Natalie is probably the least gamey of all the people that I talk to, but she's tech literate and she understands stories. When I ask about the playful spaces in her life, Natalie talks about the curated space of Instagram versus the playful space of Instagram stories, about filling up her Apple Watch activity rings, about Tinder, about having a Mega Drive and a DS Lite when she was younger, but not really playing anything but word games on her phone now. Quote, she says, "A lot of the work at Teatr Fahudzi, which is her company, is about don't ask audiences to change. An audience that are currently not spending time in your venue, let them dictate the way that you engage with them." So with each of the four people that I spoke to, a main theme or idea emerged and resolved by the end of each conversation, and I was usefully surprised each time. With Natalie, our conversation began to settle around the idea that difference is not character. She told me that she wants to start with black as an assumption. When she talks about the intersections in her life, a queer woman exploring Christianity, a black woman with a Scottish accent, in the stories we see about blackness, it's often portrayed as one thing only, urban or conservative Christian or focused on a struggle. Natalie said, for this hypothetical game that we were designing together, when you portray a character, start with the assumption they're black, and don't make that the thing that makes them interesting. Make it normal. If you're writing a story with a hero in it, she doesn't care what the story is so long as it's against the grain of the stories that were already told. Quote, "Who's the most far away from protagonist? Who do we never see leaders? That's the protagonist. It doesn't really matter what the story is, it just has to be counter the primary narrative. The political act is actually all the other stuff, the normal stuff, because to spend too much time on the blackness just reinforces this idea of difference." So as she and I begin to spitball ideas, we find points where I begin to feel like the proposition of being a white woman playing a black woman's stories feels kind of icky, a bit like digital blackface. And I expressed this to Natalie, and she took us of one of the most interesting idea threads that I'd heard in ages. She was looking for a means of finding ways to say not you are this person, but saying you are like this person. She thought of the character selection or design screen, and she thought, what if you were asked about your politics, your place of birth, education, and were cast as a black woman, Hannah, or an Asian grandmother, or a Polish migrant? A character selection screen which drew similarities through difference. Quote, "I'd love for a way to find unity between you and a black woman, where that's the purest representation of you in that space or place. What if you had to select your character and it was about the echoing of your politics or where you grew up or who you end up as is very different to you aesthetically?" So this emphasizes this truth that a character in a film, a play, or a game is your lens for an experience, not you in another place. We often hear people say hyperbolic things like games are really good at empathy, or have people describe games as empathy games, and I think it's probably because of the form being seen as like first person and all these cliches we have about empathy, about walking in other people's shoes. But speaking with Natalie about character selection, I was able to clarify something in my mind and my practice about games that deal in marginalized experiences. The assumption that telling a story in first person is equivalent to empathy misunderstands that empathy is not a product, but it is a process, and it's not about understanding the personal experience of oppression, but in trusting the accounts and worth of people who are not you. Empathy is a first-person act about a third-person experience. Let's turn to the next person. Cecilia Leon Alvarez, or Cia, who was introduced to me about a year ago as someone who really desperately wanted to work in games but had no idea how to get there. I mentored her on and off for about half a year, and I wanted to speak to her as a really avid gamer who holds games as responsible for a lot of who she is today, and talk to her about how they could better serve her. Cia's pronouns are she, her, and she describes herself as, quote, queer, working-class woman of colour who is autistic and mentally ill. I'm invisible everywhere. I've got layers and layers of invisibility on me. Not just in games, but they are a pointed example of me not existing in an entire medium. I'm non-standard. I am the optional extra. Everything I am is in addition to the primary model of the human being. Cia also talks about the qualities of being someone who never lived in a world without the internet. She was a teenager in the thick of early 2000s online gaming communities, which she accessed via a free internet connection in her local library. Quote, you could choose who you were from scratch. It was a true meritocracy. It was about how much time you spent there, how much you cared, how good you were. It was vital to me as a form of escapism as a teenager. If I have lived pre-internet, I would have been a book child and I would have been worse off for it. Cia also talks about how she feels especially wary about online spaces now since Gamergate. We've all been poisoned by Gamergate, and that means a lot of people who make AAA games, which are not just blockbusters, but tastemakers for the whole community, can hide the poisonous things they do behind a veneer of profitability, like choosing the most brand protagonist, white, muscly, stubbly man, which is inextricably intertwined with believing white, cis, straight, middle-class men are the standard unit of a human. I'll say it again, it's still boring, it's still true. White, cis, straight, het, middle-class men are a minority group. Why are they almost all of our protagonists? Cia also reflects Natalie's idea that she's interested in similarities, not differences. Quote, I don't think story shapes belong to anybody. The problem is the protagonist. If you boil down the coming out story, isn't it about loneliness? If you boil down sexism, isn't it about being a second-class citizen for no reason? If you look at the immigrant narrative, the place is changed, but the story is the same, feeling like a stranger. As Cia and I move on to talk about the kinds of games she wants to see in the world, she very quickly explains how little she is interested in games that want to teach. Just as there is a lot of shit performance out there that wants to be political, there's a lot of seriously worthy game design that wants to teach us about difference, which Cia finds exhausting and ineffective. Preaching to the converted, she says, making me think of the phrase, preaching to the unaffected. Still centres the lens of the neutral everyman. What she needs is escape, she says. Escapism is a tool for survival, that's a quote. Cia speaks carefully about this in the context of her worry that designing games with or for marginalised people's stories ends up being in danger of creating, quote, different, better prisons for marginalised people, pinning them in under the heading of autobiographical or serious or empathy games. Quote, if people feel like they have a duty to include, say, refugees or sex workers or trans folk, they will default to the place they think that story belongs, which is just a different, better prison. That's not the same as seeing them as real people. The message again, make difference normal. So I return to the question, if we're designing for her radical difference, or rather actually her normal, what should we make? And here she turns to what she calls the wonderful world of mods, finding ways to enjoy rich and complex AAA universes, but being able to play it in the way that fits your needs, modifying it to remove the peril or making your character non-binary. She also talks about the escapism of being able to play white. Quote, having a go at agency, having a go at being someone who matters, not just being picked for the job I want, but saving the world. That's enormous. It's a break. The only go I get in life at being someone whose actions matter. That kind of feeling makes marginalised people stronger and more resilient for the work they have to do in the real world. So Sia was interested in how modding that was supported by developers could be used to disrupt the idea of canon, of the true story of a game that gatekeepers can defend and own. I get really excited by the really radical seed of an idea that's there. Like, it may not be practical, but it's certainly useful. What if the makers of AAA games bought mods both intellectually and canonically? There's probably a bunch of issues where that would turn out to be a terrible idea. It would turn modding into spec work and probably reduce its radical potential in the end. But marginalised people are so used to having to create head canon when actual canon disappoints. But why should we place that burden of work on them? Sia spoke about the possibility of a AAA IP owner finding the community work behind, for example, gender and sexuality mods, and buying them off the creators to offer DLC. But, and this is the useful mental gymnastics bit, saying this is canon now, disrupting the ownership by the cis-het white able-bodied player, giving Sia the room that she needs to breathe. I don't know if it works, but it's such a wonderful provocation. Harry Josephine Giles is a writer and performer. Their pronouns are they, them. They grew up in Orkney, which is a remote island off the Scottish coast, and they now live in Edinburgh. They describe themselves as a genderqueer person, which means that moving about the physical world, I often have to deal with a lot of looking weird, I suppose, which is uncomfortable. Occasionally harassment, but just being looked at oddly. And then the other relevant thing is that I'm diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, and that comes with social impairments and sensory impairments. So on the one hand, I find a lot of social space hard to be in, confusing, and I'm more apt to be overloaded by stimuli. Harry Josephine works mostly in poetry, but also does some work in games and plays a lot of games, from video games to tabletop and board games. Quote, "If it weren't such a horrible community, I would call myself a gamer." Harry Josephine largely plays games on a laptop. They don't have a console or game system, and they're also a big part of the world of interactive fiction. Quote, "Games are mostly a means of artistic expression that I'm interested in, but I also do play games for escapism and pleasure, just joy. That for me is very connected to artistic expression. That's the same way I engage with books and film and music." So for Harry Josephine, the pleasure of games is both in following rules and restrictions, but also about breaking rules or patterns to gain insight. They are particularly interested in that as a quality of games because, quote, "This is to do with autism as an experience of the world. I have a mind always looking for patterns." When I ask about what games they want to see in the world, they express skepticism about mainstream storytelling. Quote, "I'm very suspicious of mainstream storytelling, and I'm not sure I want my life to be a part of it. There's a book called Trapdoor about this moment of trans visibility. It talks about it as both a trap and a door. It opens you into something, but it's also a trap that you can get stuck in. So, for example, we're in this moment of trans visibility, and what that actually means is a rise in trans hate crime." Quote, end quote, sorry. "So when you grow up never seeing yourself represented in the stories that you see in the world, it can make it hard for you to name yourself. But in the difficult period where those stories start to be visible, it can make you vulnerable and exposed." Quote, "It was really cool to play as a bi character in Mass Effect. If there had been more of that when I was a teenager, maybe some more of my life would have been easier. But I think it might also have limited me, because the trans representations we have now are part of a big effort to trap trans folk into a binary existence, and the same can go for autism representation." So when I ask Harry Josephine about what games they want to see in the world, we turn towards more abstract, non-narrative driven games ideas. Designers, I think, well, I certainly do, often think of game design for difference as being story-driven, about advocacy and awareness raising, but when you take that approach, you are designing through the lens of the unaffected. That's why I want to think about not just how to diversify and decolonize whose stories we tell, but also diversify and decolonize the idea of the players that we're telling these stories to or giving these experiences to. In the end, Harry Josephine and I riff on non-narrative centered ideas, and we have this idea of a game that perhaps is enabled by smartphones in the same way that Drawful is, which would explore different restrictions and forms of communication Connected to Harry Josephine's experience of autism, it would highlight that not everyone communicates or can communicate in the same way. A little bit like a mix between charades and bees communicating through dance. This game would include different teams who have to communicate a message, but have restrictions given to them on how they can do so, such as not being able to move anything but your mouth, not using discernible words, dancing, having a restricted vocabulary, only being able to use a monotone, or speaking in a restricted rhythm. We thought of maybe using a nice story wrapper, like a resistance movement trying to avoid detection. Crucially though, going through this process with Harry Josephine enabled me to realise some design decisions that I might have made, for example, only being able to communicate when other people are talking over you, are actually really inaccessible for them. So this game should also include a veto at the beginning from players where they can remove certain restrictions or styles of restrictions from play. This way, we also end up with a game which everyone consents to how silly or difficult that they might find it. As Harry Josephine puts it, when you think through different people's experiences of the world, you find new aesthetics which might be exciting for everyone. You discover ideas you might miss because your experience of the world is limited to a sample of one. Learning about the experiences of people who aren't often talked about, or two, gives you new ideas of how to make art or fun. So the final person that I want to introduce you to today is my mum, Linda Nicklin. It was important to me to include a voice in these conversations who was over the age of 40, who is in fact exactly the kind of person games communities reference when they talk about people who don't get games. Even your mom can play this. Apologies to Americans in the audience. So let's meet my mum. She's a 66-year-old white woman with differing degrees of arthritis and a blood disorder called hematomacrosis, which holds her back very little. She broke her foot in a salsa dancing class in Costa Rica a few months ago, and it's taking her a while to heal. Her pronouns are she, her. She was born working class and has worked in social care with people with disabilities her whole life. She rides bikes, lifts weights, makes bread, sews clothes, writes stories, and she says that she is, quote, interested in health. I've got quite a strong understanding of disability and impairment, but not as an other, but as an experience that most people will have at some point in their lives. To have an impairment is normal and usual, and as you get older, you will acquire more. She tells me the story of one of the people that she used to work with who would describe what we would describe able-bodied people as the not yet disabled. At a quite young age, my mum taught me about the social model of disability, that it's design in society that makes people disabled, not their impairments. In the same way, it's our game design that will alienate people, for example, with colour blindness or sight impairments or hearing difficulties. My mum also plays a wide variety of games on iPad, mobile, and her laptop, from hyper-realistic first-person survival sandbox games like The Long Dark, which she likes because she is a prepper. No, genuinely, she is. To funny games like The Cave, she was super into the sense of humour in that, and sim games like The Pandemic, because my mum was the World Health Organization first respondent for our county in England, which means that she's really good at directing diseases. And she also likes abstract puzzle games. She talks about feeling a little alone amongst her friends sometimes in her use of computers. She talks about how she taught her friends, for example, how to use the internet to research LGBTQ resources so they could have discussions with their grandchildren, and how she's part of a generation that might never have had to even use a computer in their job. Quote, I don't have many friends that I can actually talk to about computers because they don't get at all what I'm talking about. But that doesn't mean that they should be excluded. Rather, it means they should be reached out to. And like every other person I spoke to, she talks about invisibility, how when society looks at her, they don't, quote, see someone who's worked all over the country, been a lecturer, who's travelled all around the world, who's got opinions and politics and dreams and plans for the future and strong opinions. Economics has polluted every value, she says. It means you're not a financial asset. If you're not a financial asset, you're of no worth. And we've forgotten to value other things in people of all ages. Society runs on the free labour of grandparents and retired people. There's a lot of ways in which we're productive, but you can't quantify easily with money. As she and I begin to talk about how games currently fit into her life, she talks about her relationship to time, how she doesn't play games with a story that will draw her back in like a book, because she wants games that she can choose easily when to put down and pick up. Quote, "A game needs to have an outcome I can quantify in terms of satisfaction. I'm 65, I spoke to her before her birthday. None of us know how long we've got, but on average, I've got 20 years, and that doesn't seem like that long. I've got to make the most of my health. Time becomes more precious the older that you get." But also, she likes games that keep her moving or active. She talks about Strava, which is a cycling and running app which records you through discrete segments of road and ranks you against other people of your age and gender. She tells me about the determination with which she is currently training to beat the woman who has the fastest time on all of her nearby roads, someone she's never met called Consuela. She says, quote, "I have seriously considered doing hill reps until I'm faster than Consuela." When we begin to think about the game that she would like to see in the world, the game for her, it only takes one thought, and then this fully formed game idea tumbles out of her mind. She begins with the idea of older people in games. So she says, "I want old people who aren't a burden but a resource. If there's a character who's old, don't let them be an obstacle. Make them valuable or skillful." I ask her, "How is this a game then?" And she describes it immediately and in detail. It becomes this meditation on memory and loss, and perhaps a little bit on dementia, or perhaps just the tangle of a life lived fully. So what follows is a direct transcription of what she said to me. "There is a blank silence and a blank screen and a slow appearance of a moon that would hiss, and as it becomes revealed, there would be this pulse and a soundtrack. You see the whole moon, and there's someone on it. But as the moon becomes more visible, the clear picture of it that it was made up of is suddenly jumbled like a jigsaw piece. They've got a jumble of pictures and sounds, and they're trying to put it back together again. And what it is a story that relates to a life. All of those pieces are experiences, like a multi-sensory scrapbook. Perhaps all the pieces are scattered around and you have to go on journeys to help understand and replace parts. Or we could go and find things to add to the collection. So it'd be a collaboration between the player and the character. And you could have different parts for things like regrets, things that you miss, and treasures, stuff like that. Sometimes maybe you just sit, or float around on a balloon, because how else would you get to the moon? And you sit, and your dog can come and sit with you for a little while. It would need to be intriguing and delightful and not too deep, but then at the end of it, you would have somebody who you recognize, that greets you with all of these aspects of themselves, a person. In a medium where we design for interaction, the player is both everything and nothing. You don't know who they are. You don't know their gender identity or class background, their sexuality, race, age, religion, or religious heritage. You don't know what their first language is, if they have impairments, mental health issues, neurodiversity. You don't know where they are, what time it is, what they're worrying about, or who's nearby. And it's actually kind of important that we admit that player is a useful pretense, an abstraction of everyone you hope will play your game, but also everyone who you can't imagine will play it. So when I design video games, I feel like the player is one of the last assumptions in my mind to fall. In most of the discussions I have, we speak about the player, and they are always in my head a societally neutral idea of player, which falls back on this idea of an everyman. The player is a material made up of people, and by this I mean I think it's useful for us to think of the player as a material which is absolutely not neutral. In that context, instead of seeing game design as a thing done for a neutral player, what might a game design of radical difference look like when centered on the player? What stories would we tell? What games would we design if we were designing for any other extremely specific experience than the very specific everyman? We might find fresher stories, fuller stories, ideas that delight everyone and start from a point of inclusion rather than adding it on later. Games for players who don't currently play games or play them despite how they are treated. I know talks very often try and offer a takeaway or golden rule that you can apply to your design and development, but I'm not saying this is the way everyone should make games. I'm saying that I think as good designers, we should iterate on how we think about our thinking when we make games, especially as we do the necessary work to diversify and decolonize our stories, our industry, and our creative and working practices. By the way, join a union. So this thought experiment sits alongside many other things that we need to do. And the conversations I had with Natalie, Sia, Harry, Josephine, and my mum all helped me better articulate what that work is for me. That includes, wherever I have the power to do so, hiring people who don't look like me. When I think of the player, imagining different people, running workshops and playtesting and consultancy with people I don't know who aren't like me, mentoring and sharing my privilege, using it to build bridges, making black and brown, trans, old, impaired, queer and fat bodies normal, making characters more than their difference, making games for the spaces that people need to escape to and relax in, making games that see people, making games that listen. Thank you for your time, and thank you for listening to Natalie, Sia, Harry, Josephine, and Linda Nicklin.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was beautiful. I got tears throughout.
Oh, do you want a hug?
We have about 15 minutes for questions. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand and we will bring a microphone to you.
I'm just going to get a pen because I like to write down questions when they're given to me.
Hi, my name is Gemma.
Hi, Gemma.
And I really liked the Natalie's story. I really resonate with because I'm from a mixed race background and was also actually born in Britain. Mm-hmm. Except that I'm the lightest person, as in lightest skinned person in my immediate family.
Yeah.
And I played Pokemon Go, and I've actually chosen to be darker than I originally appear in real life, mm-hmm. to reflect my South Asian Indian heritage.
Yeah.
I guess this is a bit of a complicated question, but am I allowed to do that, or am I performing brownface?
Oh, okay. That is certainly not for me to answer. But I would say, I will get to that in a second, but I guess I should say that normally the rule is ask questions, don't just offer a comment in Q&As, but if you are a marginalised person and you want to share something with us, with the audience today, I'd really welcome that. You don't have to have a question if you just want to speak about your experience within the time that we have. Are you performing brownface? It's really fucking difficult, right? Like, because I can only speak to things I hear people speak about because it's not my experience. I watched a video on The Guardian the other day of black women talking about of skin tone and discussing what it is to pass as white and how you can show solidarity to one another by sort of passing that on and stuff. In terms of like performing brownface though, I don't think that's a thing that I feel qualified in any way to like help you with, but I hear you, and I encourage you to find ways to answer that question yourself through your practice or in your communities, that kind of thing. Like if you can, I'm not actually very good at being a human with feelings. I can only express my feelings and emotions through art. And so if this is a thing that you struggle with, then I encourage you to make a project about it and use that as a way, as almost an excuse to talk to your community about, because sometimes you do need structures to have these conversations, and art is a really useful structure.
Cool. Thank you.
coming back to your point about play being everything and nothing, and the idea that there's always going to be someone who feels excluded by the experience that you try to create for everyone.
Mhm.
To what extent can you get around the problem by not picking on those aspects, like allowing people to choose their skin color or eye color or gender, or allowing them to be completely blue, for example?
Sure. I suppose certainly all of the people that I spoke to talked about escapism as being a useful thing, and the idea of trying to make things more accessible by offering more choice. So Watch Dogs is an example that I would draw on here. So a lot of people pointed to the most recent Watch Dogs as being interesting because one of the characters was a black man in tech, and it actually showed some of the real life forces of oppression that you experience as a black man working in tech. There were people from the, for want of a much better word, black community who said, I don't want to play my oppression. Like, I kind of like not having to live with it in games, and I don't necessarily want to see it represented. So I think that there are just lots of different ways to access this stuff. Sometimes it's actually going more abstract. Sometimes it's walking away from the idea that you can actually fully represent anyone. I guess the could you just make them blue thing is a little bit close to that color blindness argument that white people very often make, where white people say, I don't care if you're black, brown, or blue, man. You're just the same to me, which obviously completely erases the fact that the experience for a person of color is one situated in a bunch of stuff they can't walk away from. They can't turn themselves blue. And actually, if you were blue, you probably would be pretty oppressed. So I think that there is definitely room for genuinely making the effort to diversify character design screens, that kind of thing. For example, like hair has been really shitty for a really long time, even if you can like change the color of characters. So there is work to do there in photorealistic, like AAA style games. But if a lot of the people in this room will be working in indie kind of small company or single designer contexts, and there I think we have to think more creatively about how we decolonize our practices. So that's where this question comes from, I guess. There you go. That was a lot of talking, I'm sorry.
More questions?
It's a long old way to run. Somewhere up there, that's good.
So what you touched on there is something I grapple with when I think about making games in sort of like a period game, right? Something or fantasy based or something set in a period where equality is would not be in that society. You would not expect that, some medieval kingdom would be very fair on women in any sense of it. So it's something I've heard BioWare touch on, where they're like, in Dragon Age, if you're going to play a female character, do you want to be constantly wolf whistled and harassed as you walk through the world, whereas the male version of the game walks through completely untouched and admired? I guess the question is, you were saying, what is the best approach to when designing a game in a world where women would not be accepted, or that identity would not be accepted? Is it better to be that real, or is it to sort of just work in a fantasy universe of suspension of disbelief that they are equal in that area? Sure. And it's not mentioned? That's my question.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. There are two ways to approach that. The first is it is an absolute fallacy that people of colour and women weren't... there are a lot of ideas that our current view of fantasy, which was invented by a bunch of white dudes in the last century or so, that is actually historical. It really, really isn't. History that we have right now in the West, certainly in a white European West context, is absolutely written by a bunch of people whom are the only people it represents. It's written by white men, and that is who the history represents. There are all over the world matriarchal societies. There are all over the world evidence that our reading of history is completely wrong. So Viking burials, where they've just assumed everyone with a weapon is a man, and then they actually get around to DNA testing it 50 years later and they find out that they're all women. This kind of stuff is the stuff on which our fantasy and our historical fiction is built on, and there is work to be done decolonizing that. So I don't think it's ahistorical at all to do that work, and I think that work with historians who specialize in breaking down a lot of those myths, work with the historians from don't work just with historians from white academic culture, work with historians, the equivalent of historians in native communities and in other communities from around the world. And then as another point of view on that, I think that one of the most powerful works of decolonizing that kind of fantasy and historical work of the past decade was 80 Days. I don't know if you've played 80 Days. If anyone hasn't here, it's a retelling of, is Jules Verne, is that who made it? Jules Verne. Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days, written, it was a collaboration between Meg Jantz and Inkle. Is that the studio or is that the engine? Okay. Yeah, okay, great. The engine is Inkle is the studio. And it is a radically decolonized and de-gender marginalized retelling, which doesn't feel crowbarred in. It doesn't feel like it feels historical and is based on a bunch of true stories. So if you want an example of how we can decolonize that historical or fantasy setting, I guess it's kind of steampunky as well, absolutely go and check out 80 Days, which is a really accessible game. Thank you for your question. I hope that was...
Thanks.
Yeah.
We have time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions.
Or expressions of your own experience, if you wish.
Yeah, question back.
Hello.
Hi there.
I wanted to say thanks for interviewing your mum, because I'm a mum and everyone forgets that I play games too, since I became one. And also, it's an extremely simple question. I just wanted to know if you've played Heaven's Vault.
I haven't, and I should, and I really want to. I don't actually. I had a housemate for 4 years who owned a PS4, so I never had to own one myself. And I just moved into my own place, so I'm saving up because I want to play that on console, I think. I really want to play it, and it looks really fascinating. If anyone hasn't seen it, it's the next thing from Inkle. It's not with Meg. It's a different writer that they're working with, but it's about the act of translation and of trying to understand a language. And from everything I hear about it, it's a really wonderful piece of writing and game storytelling. So check it out. Maybe we should have maybe I should stream myself really not doing very well at the game, and we can all join in together. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to it, and yeah, thanks for bringing it up.
Any more questions? Was that a question maybe? Oh yeah.
Who is it? Put your hand up. I missed. Oh, hi.
Thanks. I just wanted to say thanks for your talk. And one of the things an earlier question that came up was about blackfacing. And I don't want to speak, obviously I can only speak for myself as a person of colour. And I just wanted to say that if to play a black woman was blackfacing, I feel like I've been, by contrast, white-facing my whole life by playing white characters. But I think that the sentiment of playing another character who you don't look like and who's different experiences and different all those elements, I think that's totally fine. Like that's totally a way of understanding someone else's point of view and feeling empathy and things like that. And so, like in terms of just like talking about, if you want to play a brown character, do so. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think that's brown facing as such, especially without intention.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. I suppose to try and speak for the people that I spoke to a little bit, because I was in obviously a longer conversation than I reported, it felt like what they were saying is it's fine that exists, but it's not fine if that's the only way that exists. Particularly with the idea that you should walk in someone else's shoes, again, that centers like white gamers, because it's about teaching them. And actually, sometimes people of colour should have games that aren't about teaching white people, you know? So I think that was their point. That's how I took it anyway. But yeah, you're absolutely right. That's not to say that that stuff isn't valuable and shouldn't exist.
Yeah, but obviously I appreciate your sensitivity in thinking about those things, but yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Thank you very much for that talk. It was really, I loved how you talk about the empathy level of things, like how it's such a complicated subject, how we empathize and what are multiple ways of empathizing. My question is more from, I guess sort of an advice that I would like to ask for, if you can give it, is in your history of working with people and doing these games and projects and theatre with many different people, like you said, when something starts to be visible, one of the people you interviewed said, once you start being more visible, you become more vulnerable too. And I speak from an intersectionality situation where I'm still going, should I be talking about my intersectionality? I'm not sure how many sides will attack me, right? How do you have any advice for learning how to handle that, how to step into that? And, you know, I don't want to say don't be afraid, because fear is important to have, but how to manage it.
Okay, so your question is how to, in games practice or just in life?
How to create things,
Okay.
and not hide. Like how to not stop yourself from creating things because you're afraid of that vulnerability.
Absolutely. Good question. So again, I can speak for my own practice, which is not particularly, my personal experience is not super intersectional. I'm a white middle-class woman, English first language, which is an incredible privilege. But I can speak to cowardice, that feeling that you are exhibiting cowardice, because that's a thing that we all feel. And like I said before, I'm pretty scared of feelings, and like to give myself nice, safe structures to explore them in. I think my advice is find a mentor, because the first 5 years of my practice, which were in theatre and experimental performance, it's really common to have mentors. It's really common for companies to run mentoring programs. A lot of the funding in the UK is based on the fact that you would give back to the community. And the mentorships that I had early on in my career, a lot of them were about how to build the tools with which to explore the stuff I was trying to understand. So in theatre and performance, that was like games and exercises and structures through which I could experiment with telling a story. And in the safety of the rehearsal room, which was almost always a safety that was constructed by a mentor who'd already done that kind of practice. So I guess my advice to you would be to find someone in your area of practice or just in your communities who are also dealing with the same kind of intersectionalities that you are, and ask them if they could either formally or informally mentor you, whether that be just like having coffee once a month and talking about whatever you want, or if you want a more structured kind of experience, then be clear about that. And if you want to DM me on Twitter, that's my Twitter name, and you want any recommendations for people, I'll send a request out into my networks and see if there's anyone out there. But I think that's probably finding people who've been through the same thing. Solidarity is actually probably the thing that has given me the most courage to deal with the world and press forward in my life, I think. So
Thank you.
it's okay. That was a tough one.
All right, I think that's all the time we have. Can we thank Hannah for the time?